Hi, this is Beth from Around the Table Yarns, and tonight is the second section of the Wren pullover sweater from the Woolfolk design team. Today we are getting started with the knitting of the sweater and doing the back. Next month we'll be doing the front. The front and the back are very similar, but we will be talking about alterations for the neckline, and you have to do your back first before you do the front if you want to have a different neckline. So what I want to go over today are 4 things. I want to go over the cast on. I want to talk a little bit, only a couple of the sizes that I looked at have increases after the ribbing and at the underarm, and so I want to talk about ways to do that. The recommended short row, or the designers used the wrap and turn method for short rows, and I'm going to show you what I prefer, which is the German short rows. And then I want to talk a little bit about neckline alterations so that we can be ready for doing our fronts next month, not next week. Next week is not sock club. So that's what we're going to work on today on this video, and I'm going to get started with the cast on. It's recommended to do a long tail cast on, and so I just want to cover some things about the long tail that you may already know or you may not know. And the first is how long a tail. If you are doing hundreds of stitches or over 100 stitches, the length of the tail can be somewhat problematic. And I recently taught a cast on class for our retreat, and I did some research into the long tail cast on, which is by far the most versatile of the cast ons. So the first thing that I learned in doing my research, I mean, I've been doing them for a long time. I want to make sure that this background is good. Okay. I've been doing them for a long time, but estimating the length of the tail is the first issue that most people have. And what I read was from Patty Lyons in her book of knitting tips and tricks. And she recommended that you always leave a long enough tail. So 5 or 6 inches is the recommended amount. And then you can so leaving that amount, you would wrap your working yarn around the needle 10 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And pinch it at each end as you unwind it. This length is 10 stitches worth of yarn. So you can walk this length down, and it doesn't have to be really exact, but here's 10 more stitches. So if I pinch it here, I've got 20 stitches. And if I walk that down, now I've got 40 stitches, 60, 80, 100, 120, and so on. So that's a way to measure off the number of inches of tail that you need, or the length of tail that you need for the number of stitches that you have. And I thought that was very helpful and useful. In addition, I have been known to do you need me?
No, I was
okay. Sorry, my husband's visiting. I have been known to be lazy about this, and I would say that this method, so I tried that method out, the walking it down, and I found that it worked in a cast on of over 100 stitches. And so I thought that was very helpful to know that this is a method that works when you have a large number of stitches. When I have a large number of stitches and no patience, I do this. I start at the end and I go 30, 60, 90, 120. And that's longer than what I just measured off previously, but that would be how I would do it when I'm being a cheater. And then I might do another one just for good luck because I don't want to run out. And I would say 99 times out of 100, if I do it that way, I don't run out and I'm fine. But if you wrap it around, if you take the extra step and wrap it around and step it down or walk it down the thing, you will probably have a better chance, better than 99%, that you'll have enough yarn. And it never hurts to add an extra 12 or so inches. So that's the first thing about the long tail cast on that I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say about the long tail cast on is that it is, we're used to putting a slip knot onto the needle to start. However, when you do that, you're creating a knot in your fabric. The slip knot right there is different than a knitted stitch. And so Patty Lyons does not recommend the slip knot. She actually has you just lay the yarn with the tail forward. So the tail's coming towards me. And I'm just holding it there with my pointer. And spread it as usual. So look, there's no stitch on my needle yet. And make your first stitch. Oop. With the long tail cast on. And now you have 2 stitches and there's no knot at the base of that first stitch. So that is the recommendation for the long tail cast on, to start it, to have no knot at that. And then the other thing that she recommends is that you keep a finger on it to space the stitches out. And her description is that the stitches along the long tail are like Las Vegas showgirls with big headdresses. And so if you imagine a stitch being sort of this shape, when you cast them on with not enough room between them, then you get a sad frown in your hem because they're all squished along and their bigger tops spread them out so that you get this sad frown. So what she recommends is spacing them out. And to do that, she keeps her pointer finger on the stitch as she makes the next one. So see how they're spaced between my pointer finger? That allows them to not be crowded. And then you put your pointer finger over the just made stitch and make the next one. And that allows you to have them spaced out enough that there's not this sad frown at the bottom. So I thought that was really helpful. And the last thing that she said was that your leading yarn, the tail, can become very twisted. And I've already started this, but I'm going to take it off for a second. And I'm going to just say, if this is, you've measured off your tail. So I'm holding it at the point where the tail ends. So here's my tail here. And this is the working yarn. I'm holding it with the tail out. So this is my tail. And what she has you do, holding it there at the point where it's connected to the working yarn, she just has you do a figure 8 of the tail until you're about to run out of it. Then you take the figure 8 off of your fingers and you make a loop. So I'm going to make a backwards loop and put it over the top of my figure 8. Like that, and tighten. And then I'm going to do it again. I'm using little tiny yarn, so it's a little fiddly, and it's a little fiddly to do this. So I did a second one, and now I'm going to do a third one just for good measure. And what I've done is I've created a butterfly. But I've created a butterfly that pulls. So this is the tail, it's pretty firm. This is the working yarn. So now holding this, my needle fell. holding the tail forward like we said, make your first stitch, make all your stitches. So I'm using my finger to space them. And I start to use up my tail. And you can pull the next loop out without disturbing the butterfly, which is really helpful. But the best part about this is if you've ever done a long-tailed cast on with many stitches, like more than 20, it starts to unply your yarn. Have you noticed that? You don't want the yarn in your hem to be unplied because it's weaker. So what you want is for this yarn to be able to reply itself. And with the butterfly, you can hang it down, and just like the phone and the phone cord, the butterfly turns and untwizzles itself and replies the yarn. So I thought that was a really helpful thing. And then, of course, in case there's anybody watching who doesn't know how to do a long tail cast on, I do a little drawing on my hands, and I put a 1 here and a 2 at the tip of my pointer. I need a pen that writes on my fingers. And a 3 at the top of my thumb. So 1, 2, 3. When I make, I grab my yarn and spread it between my pointer and my thumb and bring it down in a V. I take the tip of my needle up my thumb from 1 towards 2. So up my thumb, I lift up that loop from 1 towards 3. And then I go to the tip of my pointer, that's number 2, and run down. So I pick up that strand, and then I run from 3 down, picking up the stitch. And that's where the long tail cast on gets easy, because you can just keep doing that. I don't let go of my working yarn and my tail as I go. I keep them in my hands so that I can just keep going. But you do have to reposition after you've used some if you're using the butterfly, so that you can get a little bit more tail off of the butterfly. So that's a little bit of a review of the long tail cast on that I hope is helpful. Okay, so the beginning of the sweater is done in ribbing. And then after the ribbing, in at least size 3 of the smallest gauge, there is an increase on either side. And so I'm just going to do a couple rows, and then I'm going to show you how I like to do an increase. There are all kinds of ways to do an increase. This is not going to be particularly visible. It will be close to the edge or the selvage of your fabric. Just going to do a purl row. But I personally really like the knit in front and back method of doing an increase. But I just want to give you a couple of heads ups for that, so that you don't, because when you do it, it is not symmetric. It's not a symmetric stitch. It's different if you do it at the beginning of the row versus the end of the row. So get to the end and put my yarn there. Hello. Okay. So above your ribbing, you want to add a stitch on either side. So they want to add 2 stitches. I would do them on either side at the beginning and the end of the row. I would do them 1 stitch in. I would do the increase at least 1 stitch in. And because I like doing the knit front and back, it's going to look like I'm doing my increase between the 2nd and the 3rd stitch from the beginning. So here between 2 and 3. and here between the second and the third stitch from the end. So when you knit front and back, so I'm going to knit one, and then I'm going to knit front and back into the next stitch. So that would look, the direction would look like knit one, knit front and back, and then work to the last 3 stitches. And then you're going to knit front and back, last 2 stitches, 3 stitches, knit 2. So it's not symmetric. You have a knit 1 at the beginning of the row and a knit 2 at the end of the row. And the reason for that is that the increase of a knit front and back stays on the left side of the stitch, just like that. So you've got your knit 1, your knit in the front, and your knit in the back. And the knit in the back has this little bar underneath it that is visible between it and the next stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and knit the next stitches. So one of the names for this is the bar increase. I like it, especially if you're doing an increase in ribbing or near ribbing, because it looks like a purl stitch, so it can blend in with the ribbing really nicely. I also like it because it creates a stitch without a hole under it. And to me, that's a plus. Also, I don't have to remember if I need to go through the left or the right or the back or the front or the under or the over, and I don't. So when you make one left or right, and you're pulling up yarn from between the stitches, I find that that can be somewhat hard for people to remember. But knitting into the front and the back is a technique that most people can do without looking it up. So again, I said it's not symmetrical. You're going to work to the last 3 stitches. So this arrow is work to the last 3 stitches, because you're going to knit in front and back into this stitch, and that's going to put the bar of the increase on its left with 2 more stitches to go. So it will look symmetric, even though the direction, the written direction, is not, doesn't seem like it will be symmetric. So I've just done it in that position. So I knit 1, knit front and back, and it looks like I have 2 knit stitches with the bar increase here. And then I knit to 3 stitches before the end. I did my knit front and back in the 3rd stitch from the end, and then I knit 2 plain. And that looks perfectly symmetric. And it gives you a nice selvage between the 1st and the 2nd stitch on each edge. It gives you a nice selvage stitch to seam between. And to me, seaming is all about having a nice selvage stitch. And we're going to get to seaming later, and I want us to continue to have nice selvage stitches. So this is the increase. If your pattern calls for an increase immediately above the ribbing, this is the increase that I would recommend. However, all the sizes have a little bit of an increase. So all of them have a little bit of an increase right at the beginning of the underarms, and then it goes up straight. So depending on which size and which weight of yarn you're using, this could be +2 or 3 stitches right at the underarm. And I want to show you the way that I would do that.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I had to do the increases, and it says repeat the ribbing until you end with a wrong side row. And then it says, and increase 2 stitches on the last row, which is a wrong side.
So
which
do it
for
on
me,
the right side row.
Okay, because I ended up doing it on the purl, the row that started with purl too. So you could still do it. It just, I didn't know if the directions were
well,
different.
and if you're doing a knit 2 purl 2 in the last row, then you can do it in a knit 2 stitch in one of
I
the
was doing,
stitches. All they want is to increase your total number by 2 stitches.
right, okay.
So, sorry.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out, I purled 2, then I did I guess it doesn't really matter. It's just, I was confused.
It
as to how
doesn't
to
matter
do-
because the next row will be knit.
Okay,
So it's no longer going to be in ribbing following
right,
that.
right, okay,
Okay,
thank you.
you're welcome. Okay, so here we are. Let's say we've gotten to the point of our underarm and they tell you to add 2 stitches. They say to do the knitted cast on, and I would just like to suggest you can do the knitted cast on or the cable cast on. And the difference is very slight. If you knit into the stitch and pull it out and put it onto that's a knitted cast on. So instead of, when we do a knit stitch, normally what we do is we go in, around, through, and we take it off. We take the old stitch off. In this case, we leave the old stitch on, pull the new stitch that we've made and put it onto the left needle to make a new stitch. And you would do that twice. So you would make the next stitch into the stitch you had just made. So it's building off of the stitches that you're making on the left-hand side. Sorry, on the right-hand side of your work. You always do it at the beginning of a row. To me, it is a little messy looking to do a knitted cast on. It looks a little slanted. I'm going to take those off and I'm just going to show you the cable cast on. Slightly different. You go between the stitches. So see how I'm in between the 2 stitches? Wrap and pull through between the stitches, put that new stitch on, and then go between the stitches again for 2 or 3 total stitches. When you knit into that, it makes a little bit more substantial a hem at the base of it, because it's both edges, both sides of the stitch as the foundation for that little blip on the pattern. So I'm just suggesting a cabled cast on. So a cabled. Yeah, it's a cable cast on. Instead of the knitted. And here I'm suggesting knit 1, KFB, work to the last 3 stitches, KFB, knit 2. So that would be on a right side row, Cheryl. But if they tell you to do it in the ribbing, then just do the knit front and back on knit stitches, or in between 2 knit stitches at each edge. Okay. So when you do the knitted or the cable cast on, you again have to do it at the beginning of the row. So you would finish, you would go all the way to the end. So I'm getting all the way over to the end. I would turn it, and then you can do the cabled cast on just like we did it before. You can do it knitwise. You can do it purlwise. There's no reason why you can't. It's doing the same thing. And then you would just start purling those stitches back. So for your increases at the underarms, the knitted cast on or the cabled cast on, you would do it and then work right into the stitches you had just increased as you work those rows. As soon as you've done it, and I forgot to do it here, you would want to knit, because remember, we're keeping the selvage stitch in garter. So you're going to knit the first stitch on the purl side and the last stitch on the purl side every row once you start in the stockinette section. And that is to make it easier for us later to seam. So I'll do it when I get to this end. So our edge stitches for the body of the sweater are going to be always knit, which is fine when you're doing the right side of the fabric, but when you're doing the purl side or the wrong side of the fabric, when you get to the end of the row, remember to knit the stitch at the beginning and the end of the row. You want to knit the stitch. And what that's going to do is give us a little bit of a sort of a toothy edge. I'll show you on my current sweater. So this is my piece that I'm working on right now. And you can see as I unroll that edge, you see how there's bumps along the edge. That's the garter stitch edging. And in between is one row. So that gives me a nice place to look. And there's my 2 stitches out with the cable cast on. So it gave me a nice firm bottom to my armhole area. All right, so the next thing, the designer has you doing short rows with a wrap and turn. And I'm not against a wrap and turn entirely, except that wrap and turns have a very different look when you resolve them. And I want to show you that issue. So I'm going to just do a couple of wrap and turns on the right side and the wrong side, and then I'm going to resolve them, and I want to show you why I think it's kind of an issue. Okay, so I'm going to knit over to the far side of my piece and do a wrap and turn. So this is how a wrap and turn would get done. So you knit to, in the case of many of the ones that I looked at today, it was 7 stitches, but it could be 6 stitches from the end. So it has you stop with a certain number of stitches left on your left-hand needle. I have 6. And what you would do is the step of a wrap and turn is you stop where you're supposed to, move the yarn to the other side, whichever one is the other side. Okay, so if you're knitting, you have to bring it to the front. If you're purling, you have to bring it to the back. Move the yarn to the other side, slip the next stitch on your left needle to the right needle, and then move the yarn back. Move the stitch back. So I always say it, move the yarn, move the stitch, move the yarn back, move the stitch back. And what happens, you can see at the base of my stitch, this yarn is wrapped around it. So move the yarn, move the stitch, move the yarn back, move the stitch back, and turn. So here's my working yarn. It's wrapped around the stitch on my right-hand needle. And then I would proceed with purling. So I'm going to purl back to the other side, or towards the other side. And you would do the same thing. Move the yarn. In this case, I'm in the front, so I'm going to move it to the back, move the stitch, move the yarn. So move the stitch from the left needle to the right needle, move the yarn back, move the stitch back, and turn. So you can see again, the working yarn is wrapped around the stitch at the end of my right-hand needle. See that wrap? And I'm ready to pop it off my needle. and I'm ready to start knitting. Okay, so why not just do that? Well, this is what a wrap and turn looks like in your fabric. I would argue that it's very subtle. It can be easy to knit right past it without seeing it if you don't put a marker on it. So if you choose to use the wrap and turn, please do mark the stitches that you have wrapped with a marker so that you know when you come to them. The issue that I have is that when you resolve them, it's easy to resolve them knitwise, and it's hard to resolve them invisibly purlwise. And so I don't like doing them. So I'm going to show you what I have to do to resolve that stitch. And then we're going to do a couple of German short rows, which is the technique I want you to try. So I'm working back to my wrapped stitch, and it is noticeable. It's less subtle because there is a bit of a gap there. So you can knit to the stitch before the gap, and that's usually helpful. And then what you do on the knit side is you put the point of your right needle into the wrap from below and into the stitch from below and pull it through both. That's the perfect time for my focus to go out, wasn't it? So I've knit through both. I'll continue to the end. And then we'll turn back and we'll resolve the one on the purl side. And then we'll look at both of them. So that's my resolved wrap and turn. It was right in this area. So that looks okay. However, you usually have, especially at shoulders, you have to do it on both sides. And this is what happens if you try and do the same set of instructions for the purl side. So I'm purling back to that wrapped stitch. Just getting further and further away the more stitches I add on the end. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's right there. There's my wrap stitch. 3 stitches away. So one way to resolve it that I've heard is that you just put your needle in purlwise and purl the 2 stitches together. And it looks like this. But there tends to be a cross of yarn across the base of that stitch. And it's just in the direction of how the wrap comes undone. So what I have tended to do, and actually this came undone. So I have tended to come to those stitches and I undo the wrap and I cross it behind my stitch as though I were cabling it almost. And then I purl them together. And then I purl to the end. And I found that if I do that, I don't see the little cross of yarn at the bottom of my short row stitch. So you can see now they look like they're the wrap happened here and they look okay. So if you do the wrap and turn, you have to be super careful with how you resolve the purl side ones so that you don't have a visible wrap and turn. So if that seems problematic or difficult, then my recommendation is to do the German short row. And the German short row is similar to, it is similarly a short row, but it does not involve a wrap. So I'm going to go to a similar position on the other end. and then come back. So I'm going to go 8 stitches before the end this time. So to do the German short row, you would move to the position. So if you do it the same way on both pieces, because otherwise your counts will be wrong, because it does change the position of the wrap by 1 stitch. So I moved to the position as indicated in the pattern. So many stitches left on the left-hand needle, and you just turn. You don't do anything, you just turn. If your yarn is in front, that's exactly where you want it. So the next step is to slip the stitch to the right-hand needle and then use the working yarn to elongate that stitch. See how when I pull up on the working yarn, it pulls the legs of that stitch up and makes it look like 2 stitches. And then I wrap back to the back to do my purl stitch. And what I've done is I've created a double, what's called a double stitch. So between my fingers is the double stitch, and it has 2 legs on each side that are joined at the top of the needle. To me, it looks like 2 fingers doing this at the top. To me, that's easier to see than a wrapped stitch. To work it in the other direction, you would work to the position where you want to go. So I'm going to do it in the same position here. But now my yarn is in back. So if you're doing it on the purl side or you're purling to the position, you need to bring your yarn, once you've turned, so you go to position, turn, make sure your yarn is in front, slip the stitch, and then pull up on the legs to create the 2 legs of your double stitch. And then proceed to knit. Resolving this is as simple as putting my needle in under both legs knitwise and knitting them together. So there, I've resolved that one. And it looks like that. So to me, it's very smooth in its resolution and makes nicer fabric after you're done with your short rows. So I'm a big fan of that method. I'm going to show you how I resolve it on the purl side. It's the same technique. So you're purling along and it tells you you're going to resolve all of your short rows. So here I come to it, and it looks different from my other stitches. It's a doubled stitch. I put my needle under both strands of that stitch and work them together as one, and then just keep going. So this is all happening in the shoulder shaping. But my preferred method of doing the shaping is the German short row, and it creates stitches that look like that. I could be doing the heel of a sock now, it looks like. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is, or before I talk about the neckline, I just want to make one other recommendation. The way that the short row section is written, they talk about, they give you like row 1 is a right side row, and you knit to so many stitches, and then they say wrap and turn. And row 2, So I'm going to say X stitches and then comma, wrap X stitches from the end and then wrap and turn. And row 2 is a wrong side row and it's purl so many stitches before the end and wrap and turn. So instead of that, so many stitches before then and the German short row, instead, and to do that, you would just turn. So it means turn and then make a double stitch, which is usually, that's a comma, abbreviated MDS, make a double stitch. And to make a double stitch, you turn, slip the first stitch purlwise with yarn in front. So the yarn's all ready. Turn with yarn in front and slip the first stitch purlwise and then pull up the slip stitch and then resume knitting. So it's pretty straightforward to do it. The other thing that goes on, and then they say in 3, it's a right side row, and you knit back to X stitches before the turn. So I would say again, GSR. And then 4, the wrong side, purl to X stitches before the turn. And then it says to repeat the last 2 rows Y number of times. And then you have the next right side row after that is knit resolving wraps and purl, and the one after that, the next wrong side row, is purl to the end. And this is purl resolving wraps to end. My handwriting's getting bad. So they give you the first 2, which are the setup of the short rows, and then they give you the interior direction and tell you how many times you're going to do it. So what I recommend is on your rows 3 and 4, however many times they tell you to repeat the last 2 rows, write that out to the right of your rows. So let's say they say to do it 4 more times. So that would be 3, 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8, 9 and 10, 11 and 12. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4 more times. Does that make sense? So to keep track of your short rows, it's really helpful if you write out what row number they would be. And then that makes the next right side row, row 13, and the last one, row 14. And that means you're turning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times. That's 6 on each side. So on your piece, you know, if this is your piece of knitting and you're doing these short rows, you're going to this side and you're making the first turn, and then you're making the second turn, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, the ninth, the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th. You'll be going, so this direction is purl, this direction is knit, if you're looking at the right side of the fabric, right? So you'll be here you'll have gone in this direction to make this turn, which is the last one. And then you'll be ready to knit all the way to here. So that when they say next right side row, knit resolving wraps, you're starting here at 12 and you're knitting back to the end. So that goes to here, and then 13, that takes you to 13. And then the last row starts from here and it resolves all of these wraps and you work to this end. So short rows should be done in one sitting because it's easy to get turned around in short rows if you stop and start. So I do recommend, it's usually only about 14 rows or 15 or 16 rows. It's usually an even number. And I do recommend doing it in one sitting. I also personally like to drop in markers as I do each row. So for example, as I do the first row, I would drop a marker here at X number of stitches from the end as I start that row. And I would maybe put another one X number of stitches from the end on this side. So I'm knitting to my second marker. Then when I turn to go back on the second row to get back to here, drop another marker in here. It's always the same for this pattern. So if my X was 5, I would work to the last 5 stitches and then turn, and you would work 5 stitches and drop in a marker. Then keep going to your other marker, turn, work your 5 stitches and drop in another marker for when you get to 4. And what I do is I cross off each row as I do it, and I circle the one I drop the markers for. So then when I've done that row and I drop the next marker, I know where I am in the pattern. So what that looks like, I'm just going to do it with a smaller number. What that looks like is, let's say my X was 3. I work to 1, 2, 3, and I drop in a marker, and then I keep going to my first turn, and I don't have a slip in marker, so I'm going to just work to my 3 stitches before the end. And so I don't have a marker there, but I could have. And then I'm going to do my German short row. I'm going to work 1. So German short row turn is 0. You work 1, 2, 3 past it. So there's my double stitch, 1, 2, 3, and I place my next marker. So I finished 1 and I've placed 2. I'm on my second row, which is a wrong side row. I purl. And I don't need to check and see where I am. I just need to go to my marker. Oh, there I am. I've gotten where I need to go. Remove the marker, turn. This is a German short row with the yarn in front. So I bring the yarn forward, slip the stitch and pull it to distort. That's 0. So count 1, 2, 3, or whatever your X is, and then replace your marker. Now I'm knitting back to the marker I placed in the row before. So I've done 2 and I'm ready to do 3. And then I don't have to count. I don't have to worry about where is my next short row. My next short row is at the marker. Remove, turn, slip, do the German short row, and then work back to the marker that you were at. And if you want to cross that off and circle, so I'm going to do 1, 2, 3. That's my circle. And I put that back in. So that's, for what it's worth, I think that makes short rows much more doable. I learned this from doing a pattern that was like, and 15 stitches before your last turn, you turn again. And it was a large number of stitches, and I was constantly counting. I was just counting and counting and counting and counting, and it was taking me forever to do what were really very short rows. And so by putting the markers in, you stop having to count. They're just there in place to keep track for you. So that's my recommendation for the short rows. The sweater has, I want to talk about the neckline alterations. The sweater has the pattern as written has a neckline that essentially you finish your short rows and you put those stitches on holders. They're live, so you put your side stitches on the holders and you come to the neckline stitches and you work in. So you do some decreases on the edges, so there's like 1, 2, 3 decreases, and then you continue working and it works out, and then you bind off. So the shape of the neckline is like that, and it's because there's my, see my edging there? This will fold over. This will be seamed to the other neckline, and the actual top of my neckline will be this smooth, very stretchy edge. This is done with smaller needles. It can be done on the same size needles, but there's a couple of points to this. It's a mock neck, a mock turtleneck. This part is very stretchy, but if your bind off is tight, even though it's more stitches, it will not go over your head. Make sure you use a really loose bind off. So you could go up a needle size to do that, or use a stretchy bind off. An example of a stretchy bind off that I've learned recently. Let me get to the end of my. Okay, so an example of a stretchy bind off that would be good for this is one where you add a yarn over before each stitch that you bind off. So knit 1, yarn over, pull the stitch over the yarn over, knit 2, bind off, yarn over, pull the stitch over the yarn over, knit a stitch, bind off, yarn over, pull the stitch over the yarn over. So every time you bind off a stitch, you do a yarn over between it and the next one, and that will make a really sloppy, loose edge. I already did that one. So yarn over, so bind off, yarn over, bind off the yarn over. Knit 1, bind off, yarn over, bind off. Knit 1, bind off, yarn over, bind off. That will give you an extra stitch in between every stitch. It's not pretty, but this will be inside the seam, and it won't matter if it's not pretty. It will give you a nice stretchy edge. Ugh. So if this is not the kind of neckline, so that is actually eventually going to look like that. because that will fold under on both sides. And so it will give you a mock neck at the top. Not everybody wants a mock neck. If you do not want a mock neck, here's my recommendation. Finish the back to the beginning of the neck shaping and put all the stitches on hold. So you'll have your shaping and your shaping, and then these stitches, you'll just put all of the stitches like on a barber cord. And don't do the neck piece at all. Then we can take your, here's my back. Ah! Here, I'm going to turn it to the face the camera. Might be a little easier to see. So let's say the back and the front pieces are identical on this pattern. So if I wanted to convert this to a different neckline, I'd want to know where to start that neckline on my back, like using the back as the pattern, as the template. So here's my shoulders, right at my shoulders, and I'd like it to come right to my collarbone. So try it on and say, okay, that's where I want the neck to start. Put a marker in there, put a safety pin right where you want the neck to start. We have to make sure that's the middle of your sweater. So we'd have to count to make sure that we are in the right, we're at the right place. You'd have to decide, okay, I like how wide this is, you know, where the edges of my neckline are for the back, or maybe you don't. Maybe you want it wider, or maybe you want it narrower. So you can make that determination with this part unfinished. So this would just not, this roll wouldn't even be there. So I'd say, okay, here's where I want it, or here's where I want it, or here's where I want it. And you would put a safety pin at that level. So then we can count up to that row and know where you want to start your neck on the other piece, on the front piece. And then we can decide if you want to make it exactly the same width as this neckline, or we can decide we want it wider or we want it narrower. We can make those adjustments. And so usually if you're doing a round neck, you would work to the lowest point of that neck and bind off the center, maybe 2 or 3 inches, and then you'd work each side of the neck separately. And you would do some decreasing, so you would bind it. It's mirror image in my video, so I'm like, I don't know what side I'm on. So you'd work over to one side of the neck, and there would be decreases to make the turn, and then it would go straight up to the top of the shoulder. But we'd have to know, like, how low do you want to start that to know how many rows we have to play with to get the shaping in. So if you want to make alterations to the neck, I'm game, I'm up for it. But you have to finish your back. And ideally, you'd have to show me or be able to do that measurement yourself from home. So if there's anybody out there who wants to make variations of the neck, call me. I'll write my number down. You love that this is on YouTube. Oh, I just folded up my camera. That's what I was messing with. So again, if we wanted to make, you know, a U shape, you would get to the lowest section. We'd figure out where this is for you, how many rows up to get to here. And then you would bind off the center 2 or 3 inches. And then you would, so you're going in, usually in this direction. So you would knit to here, and then you would leave the yarn, bind off with a new skein, and then you'd have this many stitches left. You might still be doing your shoulder shaping, so we'll have to take that into consideration. And then you'll come back to here, and there's usually either more stitches bound off at the neck edge or a series of decreases before you would work straight. And so we'd have to figure out just what kind of shape you wanted there. And then you would be doing this series of shaping on the neck side while you were continuing to do any shoulder shaping. If you wanted a V-neck, it's the same thing, except we'd start with one stitch in the middle or two stitches in the middle, and then just do decreases evenly until possibly we worked to a place where there might be no more decreases. And again, each side would be worked separately, and you would still have to do your shoulder shaping at the same time as the neck shaping. I am going to do the mock neck because I like the mock neck and I've already done it. I've already done part of it. If I hate it, though, it's possible to alter and to go backwards. Okay. So that's everything I wanted to tell you today. Any questions?
That'll get me through.
There was no math. So have a great month and get going on your backs and try and get them finished for next month. You don't have to start the front for next month. We'll be starting the front next month, and we'll be talking a little bit more about neck alterations. But that's going to be the big thing, is working on people's neck alterations. Because otherwise the two pieces are identical. What is that? Cheryl, what are you holding up?
That's the back.
You finished.
I did. Am I unmuted? You can hear me?
I can hear you.
Ooh.
Okay.
And I made you the spotlight.
Remember we talked about doing, I had three colors of yarn.
And
so
how
I
do you
did
like it?
Yeah, so there we go.
There you go.
Pretty.
Yeah. Turned out nice. I stopped before the short row.
Okay.
All right, where I'm on vacation and my granddaughter's there taking a bath. So
Okay. Well, don't put her on.
no, she just went back in the bath. So what was I saying? Oh, I didn't know how to do the German short row, so I stopped right there, and now I'm gonna do that, and I'm doing the front.
Okay.
And you're measuring out the yarn for me, all worked, and I got a nice band of the light yarn at the bottom. Thank you.
I'm so pleased. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Enjoy your vacation. Thank you for coming on. And
yeah, I gotta go.
we'll be back in a month.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Bye, Maureen.
Bye.